I've only got about 4 or 5 slides. So I've been doing with a whole group of folks a lot of analytics around regulatory impact analysis of various proposals in Canada, including Ontario's cap and trade program. And then also doing some deep decarbonization work as part of the deep decarbonization pathways work out of France. And so it's given a kind of an interesting view of sort of where are we from a regulatory perspective now, where are we going to the NDC, Canada's NDC in 2030, and then what does deeper decarbonization look like beyond. So I'm going to mix a bit of all that in here, but try and focus on the, on AB 398 and what it means for Canada. So the first, the presentation, I'm going to do about 5-8 minutes, so I won't take too long. The case for linking, we got a long history for looking at the case for linking in Canada. I'll show some pictures to that effect. Carbon bridges to somewhere. So what does this AB 398 mean for Ontario and Quebec, given that we're moving to linkage and have linkage? And we now really have sort of this, this nice North Star out into the future to start, really sort of fixing expectations around the programs. And then one quick slide in Canada's progress to our NDC and deep decarbonization beyond. So to put all this sort of Canadian abatement effort in perspective against a deeper decarbonization trajectory. So the long history. So, we've been tumbling models and numbers for a long time, looking at sort of leading, lagging, or harmonizing with the US. The graphic here is some work that we did for the National Roundtable, a bunch of folks did in 2011. And we basically ran, some economy-wide simulations, different carbon prices, and we said, okay, what matters between the two countries on leading, should we lead, lag, or harmonize? And, no matter how we look at this and more recent modeling and older modeling, we always found sort of a common outcome, which was abatement in Canada was a lot more expensive. So cost containment really mattered. So aligning on quantity targets with the US really never made sense because our abatement costs were quite high relatively, as the graph would show. And in fact, if you look at Canada's NDC, we ended up in a place where we're not following the US on their NDC number. We're actually setting a different NDC number, which I think reflects a little better sort of the structural differences in the economies. And the structural differences really boil down to sort of large oil and gas emissions that are hard to control in our national inventory. Really decarbonized electricity, sitting at 80% decarbonized electricity now, climbing much larger with current policy, maybe 85, 87% by 2030, and then versus coal electricity in the US. Vehicle fleets and housing stocks fairly similar, so high cost abatement, but really it's those two dynamics that drove some outcomes. How much does it matter? So we've done some recent modeling, the last bullets here. Even with efficient national carbon pricing that we're moving towards, unless we have significant cost containment, in the bottom slide here, or the bottom bullet, about 80 megatons of WCI imports, that's a maximum. I'll talk about that in a second. But when you start shaving off that level of sort of imports to true up to a target, we get our price falling from $220 a ton, even with an aggressive regulatory package in place, down to about $150 a ton. And no matter how much we sort of interrogate and beat up our models, we come to very similar conclusions. So that the cost containment really helps nationally. In Ontario, this is a chart from the regulatory work we did for the Ontario government on the cap and trade system. Really simple here. This is the same program linked and unlinked. So we've got a hard cap at 20 bucks, or hard price cap at 20 bucks, which is sort of the WCI price forecast in 2020. We tumble the numbers with proceeds recycling to technology investments, and we sort of get not a lot of leakage, emission leakage. We get not a lot of emission reductions in Ontario, and we get the need for a significant backstop of emission reductions. And those can come from WCI imports, pan-Canadian offsets. So the offset system is being developed now in Ontario. It's operating in Quebec, but they're expanding the protocols to accept pan-Canadian offsets. Or these could be action plan reductions from proceeds recycling. Both Quebec and Ontario have quite an aggressive complementary regulatory and proceeds recycling package. But for simplicity, we said, okay, let's just use WCI imports. And the big difference here is clearly the carbon price, 160 bucks versus $20 Canadian, linked and unlinked, which basically just says, the targets in 2030 for Ontario, very, very deep, very expensive given the structure of the economy. So linking really sort of matters to Ontario, and this sort of thinking helped push within the government of Ontario, push forward the linking agenda. Couple more slides. So what does AB 398 mean for Canada? This is pure conjecture, right? You got to be a little fearless to start saying stuff like this. But, you know, I mean, we're, you know, sort of informed somewhat. So there's 5 areas that I think AB 398 impacts Canada somewhat. I mean, the first really is on this price ceiling and the tiered speed bumps. So you know, there's 2 concerns that were talked about earlier. One, that the price follows the floor, and one, that it takes off to the ceiling really quick as that 2030 California target bites. And it looks like the price ceiling and the tiered speed bumps mute that price impact. When, you know, AB 398 talks about the social cost of carbon, well, you can think of that as maybe a price ceiling. And when you start thinking about that as a price ceiling, you're thinking about prices probably under 100 Canadian, you know, sort of 75 US, maybe more like 80 Canadian, you know, 65, 68 US. And so, you know, that the probability of moving from the floor to the ceiling, as was just talked about, starts to weight a price kind of in an interesting way. So all that to say, we have probably prices rising more than previous forecasts, but they're not taking off as much as we were probably concerned about, climbing to the ceiling over $100 really quick. So the price ceiling and the tiered speed bumps add more abatement in Canada, and I think a little more certainty. And I think it really helps clean, you know, the perception that it's cleaning up the allocations helps the political economy in Canada, that it's not over allocated, that prices are rising, that, you know, the market's going short ultimately at some time in the future. The offsets is interesting, you know, obviously puts upward pressure on the carbon price. The implications for offset supply in and out of Canada and around Canada is something I think we have to watch. My quick take is, yeah, we'll probably have more offset supply out of Canada, as maybe the California system doesn't, you know, there's not as much in the secondary market there to play with. But I could be wrong. I think that's an open question we sort of need to figure out. But certainly the higher carbon price forecast will place more offsets in supply in Canada in the longer term. The free allocations are kind of interesting. You know, the political economy with the large final emitters in Canada is, you know, one of competitiveness, really, really concerned about cross-border trade with the US. And to the extent that free allocations are approved in California, it sort of takes the pressure off governments in Canada to move away from the free allocations in the short term, and makes, I think, the policy more durable. Proceeds not relevant at all for Canada. Each jurisdiction is doing its own thing, and the federal government really doesn't have a view on proceeds recycling under its federal price floor. And finally, the federal price floor. I mean, one of the problems has been with this the federal price backstop. One, you've got sort of a price trajectory for the taxing jurisdictions, and the other is you have an exemption from that price trajectory if your cap decline is aligned with Canada's NDC. So you can have sort of provinces coexisting with 2 different carbon prices in Canada, and both being in conformance with the federal backstop price. Now you have misaligned carbon costs there, low WCI, higher price floor, climbing to $50 under the federal system Canadian. So that's caused some political economy pressures, and any movement to bring those 2 together, as we see with the tightening of AB 398, will, I think, reduce some of the pressure, especially if we see prices starting to climb after 2023, 2024, as some of the sort of recent price forecasts are indicating. So yeah, conjecture. And then, so here's the NDC in Canada. So this is some deep decarbonization work we did. The top line is sort of where emissions are and where they need to go. There's some different transitions here. The red dot's Canada's NDC. There's a 2.5, 2 degrees C, 1.5 degrees C price trajectory. This is sort of where emissions are. We think they've peaked in Canada, given the policies that have been rolled out. About a year ago, we had a gap of about 170 megatons, which was quite a large gap, and we thought it was insurmountable. Along came the federal government. They've imposed a price floor, which will pick up the laggards. We get about another 18 to 20 megatons coming off this national price floor that fills holes, doesn't preempt a lot of the existing programs, Ontario, Quebec, British Columbia, Alberta. Here's the WCI true up in Quebec and Ontario. So this is the difference between domestic abatement at the carbon prices in Ontario and Quebec through the WCI versus their targets and their abatement potential. And it's a big true up. So you're going to need offsets, you're going to need WCI imports, and you're going to need complementary policy, it looks like, and proceeds recycling. And finally, here's the Pan-Canadian framework, which has a low carbon fuel standard and has a bunch of other sort of complementary policies, climate finance, innovation, R&D. we didn't model it all, but roughly this is where we are. So Canada, you know, looks pretty well positioned to sort of bend the emissions down into the future. So I will stop there and say thank you.